Well, welcome everybody. It's good to be at BSOP again. Tuesdays. Always good to see your smiling faces. Welcome everybody around the world. Our appreciators, masters, and innovators, thank you guys for tuning in. And then anybody who hasn't seen Mirai live before or are watching on YouTube or Vimeo, welcome you guys. We appreciate you being a part of this. Very excited tonight. Tonight is actually, and if we could all cumulatively as a group, in through the nose, hold, out through the mouth, just a big deep breath. Okay, this session right now is kind of the end of that chaotic spring, like go, 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 grow, 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 water, fertilize, try to manage growth, pinch, do this, do that. This is that time when that big flush of growth, all of that session of all of this work to try and maintain the shape and train and reallocate energy and perpetuate that energy and all the things that we've been doing, we just get to dial it down because we're starting to hit some of that heat of summer, which is slowing everything down. That growth is hardening off. Those trees are photosynthesizing and they're saying, thank you. We look beautiful, and we're ready to set in for the heat of summer. And so this stream's focus is on how we take that growth, anything that was unmanaged, anything that was pinched but maybe grew past the pinch point or matured to a point it couldn't be pinched. This is the time when we get back into that energy positive to come back and do a lot of that shaping work so that we set the structure and the shape for the rest of the season and we get to be hands off, okay? So we call this stream, what do we call this stream?
Post-growth.
Post-growth management. Lee texted me and said, hey, what's the name of the stream? And I was like, good question. I pulled over, I was driving, and I was like, you know what, let's focus on post-growth management. And at Mirai, basically the way that we handle this season of growth post all of the massive push in our elongating species that you guys have seen us pinch and prune and do all that stuff on, and our single flush pines that we're either elongating, allowing to harden, or we're pinching and distributing strength, in our deciduous trees that we've been pruning, our broadleafed evergreens that you guys have seen. Do you realize the scope of work that you guys have gotten to see over the course of these BSOP streams? It's crazy, right? It's insane. For me to think back on it, it's crazy. And then you start to realize, oh, this is bonsai as a practice across the course of the year, and that's exactly what we were here to do, okay? So before we talk about growth management, I did want to dive into the concept of watering, and I'm just going to shift this so that you guys can see a little bit better. Okay, and I wanted to talk a little bit about watering, right? So the big concept of H2O. Now, what is the biggest function of water in a bonsai tree?
Cooling.
I got cooling. Anybody else? Food. What's that? Strength? Transport. Transport of what? Interesting. Okay. Anybody else? Photosynthesis. Okay, very good. All right, so we've got all of these functions of water. Now, if we just think about water in general as in its biggest role, cooling. So you could say in a big broad brushstroke, 85% of H2O is air conditioning, right? And we could say air conditioning from the perspective of like a swamp cooler, right? Transpiration. Now, how does a tree move water to its foliage mass? Through the xylem, right? And what drives that transport? Transpiration. Very good. Transpiration. So we're saying in our tree here, and here's our canopy, right? And we got a happy tree, which means water's moving very well, and we've got Mr. Sunshine is always happy, okay? And as we're losing water into gaseous form in the foliar mass, right, that water is a chain, one water molecule attached to another molecule attached to another molecule, and that puts tension on that chain. And that's what pulls water in from the soil into the root system. And in the soil, we're binding in that nitrogen, that phosphorus, that potassium, which is where we see transport, and you're absolutely correct, right? But getting that, and then we all of a sudden have that photosynthesis, and when we're adding new growth, right, we've got to be increasing the amount of photosynthesis or increasing the amount of production of metabolic processes so that we take that water and we split that baby in half, and we've got that CO2, and we split that in half, and we go C6H12O6, and all of those other things, and the byproduct is oxygen from there, right? So trees produce oxygen, we know that. Okay, this is a form of energy for the tree. Now, I was just informed that my terminology, thanks, man. Troy Cardoza, everybody, give him a round of applause. I got to give Troy particular props because as garden director at Mirai, without him, Mirai would not exist. And so, Troy, we love you, man. Thank you very much. Okay? So we get that oxygen byproduct, we get that photosynthetic product, but 85% of that is just cooling the tree. In particular, when we're heading into the heat of summer and the tree is saying, man, if I produce a soft, fleshy piece of growth that doesn't have a cuticle to stop that transpiration from taking place, and I'm losing so much water because the heat is so high, daylight length is long, I don't know if I can actually sustain that growth. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to shut it down for a little while. I'm going to cool myself because I can't move into the shade as a tree, right? I'm immobile. So I'm going to shut it down for a while. I'm going to transpire in order to be able to continue cooling myself. And I'm going to wait until temperatures become more favorable, either for the production of photosynthetic surface area, which we know some of our trees will continue to grow foliage in the fall, such as junipers, right? Or I'm just going to shut it down until temperatures get cooler and I can start photosynthesizing and creating that byproduct again in order to create that vascular tissue, which is why we see that thickening come in the fall. So you guys are moving into that point in time where this watering is taking on a very significant function of cooling. Did anybody suffer any damage from the heat this past weekend? Happens, right? This is when we start to see our trees saying, hey, I really need that air conditioning right about now, okay? All right, so let's talk about fertilization a little bit because we know, right, based on what we just talked about, that we're having a decrease in the production of new fertilization. There we go. We're having a decrease in the production of new plant material, which means we don't need as much supplemental nutrition to continue feeding the photosynthetic process, right? We've got enough in the tree. We've got our solar panels out. Those solar panels are reaching an energy positive. We're pretty much through with all of the reallocation of strength, although we're going to be doing some things tonight that are going to encourage us to continue supplementing the growth. But when we start to talk about our key application of fertilization, and we're talking about spring, right? Our quantity and our timing function on a scale like this. So if we have winter over here, we have summer right here, okay, just past the summer equinox. We have a low quantity, and we have an infrequent application, okay? So we may apply it, and we may wait 6 weeks before we apply again. Now, as that daylight length increases and our temperature increases, we also increase quantity, and we increase frequency of our fertilization. And last time I was here, we were hammering with fertilizer. We were at the upper end of quantity. We were at the most rapid application timing, every 4 weeks, okay? Over the course of the past, say, 4 to 6 weeks, and even just recently when we hit that really hot spell and we're entering July, we cross that summer equinox. If we're looking at a really warm summer, we're going to be necking down our quantity and our frequency. So at Mirai, because we know that we're going to be doing some work that's going to require some supplemental nutrition, we're going to be applying a lighter dose of fertilizer, and we're probably not going to be applying it until this fertilization has hit 6 weeks. And that next dosage is going to be our low dosage, just to give it that extra little bump heading into summer, but not too heavy. Because what does fertilizer act like in the container? It's a salt. It's a salt. So we're heading into a point in time where we're saying water is acting as what? Air conditioning. And you put a salt into the container. What does a salt do with water? Okay, it competes for water uptake. So if we look at inside the container here, and we've got our tree, and we're applying fertilization, and we get all of these ions formed, and we have this root, and inside of the root, we've got a bunch of water, and the ionic concentration in the soil is greater than the ionic concentration in the root. The water actually moves out of the root into the soil to even out the ionic concentration between both areas, right? So we don't want to be loading up a whole bunch of fertilizer into our container, increasing ionic concentration and pulling water out of the tree, which is why we start to back off and decrease quantity. So I'm going to be at my low end of quantity, and when we talk about low, we're saying 1/2 to 3/4 tablespoon of fertilizer per location, and we're going to say we're going to be waiting 6 weeks from last application to allow that content, that ionic content, to run out of the system before we apply that light dosage for that last time before we hit the peak of summer, late July, early August, okay? So just a little bit of a coverage of how we need to be handling our trees. Now, for people watching that are in Texas or Florida or Southern California, and you guys are hitting 90s, mid-90s, high 90s, low 100s, you're going to be backing off on fertilizer already, and you're probably not going to be applying another application this year. So it goes without saying. And if you're in the southern hemisphere, then you guys are entering winter, and you're also backing off on your fertilizer applications going into dormancy. Okay? Any questions about this? Any questions? Yes, sir. Hang on. Do we have a mic? We have that mic. I love your Artisan's Cup t-shirt, by the way. Way to go. Thank you.
At what temperature does the air conditioning?
Got to speak into that mic.
At what temperature
Or-
does the air conditioning kick in?
At what temperature does the air conditioning kick in? I don't know if that's on or not, but we got you. At what temperature does air conditioning kick in? Kicks in the moment that the sun rises, right? And it stops the moment that the sun sets, and actually continues if we've got wind or we've got hot temperatures over the course of the evening. So it's basically a system that says as long as water is evaporating, then that movement of water through the system is binding heat as it's moving, and as it evaporates, it removes that heat energy from the system, right? Because water, as a substance, has a very high heat retention capacity. So its ability to bind heat, hold heat, and remove heat when it's transpired is one of its fundamental characteristics, right? So for a tree, we're standing here, and the tree is taking on a ton of solar energy. The only way to remove that is water moving through that system and taking that away, okay? One of the biggest illustrations of this is a larch in the Pacific Northwest, okay? If you pinch a larch or you heavily reduce the foliage mass of a larch, it becomes more heat sensitive. If you allow a larch to elongate and grow, it becomes more heat tolerant, because the more foliage that is transpiring and moving that water through the system, the more heat it's moving through the system, and the more durable it is to hotter temperatures. Right? Now, there's a trade-off to that. You get coarser branching if you don't pinch and control that growth. But that is a piece of knowledge that illustrates the point, okay? All right, so let's go into what we're doing tonight and just take a really, really good look. So, theme for tonight in terms of post-growth management is we are now in an energy positive, okay? And this dictates everything. Now, one of the transitions that I hope you guys are starting to make, you guys online and you guys that are present, is that we function not in terms of when do we do something, tell me the timing. We're functioning on when do we do something, tell me the indicators and why. And the timing that we use to do work is when a tree gets back into energy positive, right? Energy's been produced, it's been spent, foliage has been created, it hardens off, photosynthesizes, replenishes, and once it's full, we come back in and we have the ability to do work, okay? So what I have here is a Chinese elm, which, a very spectacular Chinese elm at that. This was actually grown in California. It's probably 80, 85 years old, and there's been several pieces air layered off of this tree. Now, I'm trying to elongate the branches in the upper canopy. I noticed that I had a little casualty of the transport. That's right. So I'm trying to elongate the branches in the upper portion of this canopy. I'm going to leave these to thicken so that I can expand this and get that kind of quintessential round domed apex that an elm is known for. But all of these other branches, I really want to hold these back, okay? Because every year a tree has to grow a little bit. Now, how much we let it grow is what dictates how big it gets and how much it grows outside of the shape of its silhouette. So when I come in here and I'm pruning an elm, I always want to be looking to prune back to two buds. Now, when we look at this, okay, and you guys are looking at this piece of growth and you're saying 2 buds, now usually the first leaf that occurs after a bud opens doesn't have a bud next to it, okay? So you're looking for 2 leaves past that first leaf. Now, let me ask you guys something. Why 2? Why not 1? Okay, in case one fails. Why else? Why 2? Why not 1? Bifurcation. Very good. So when we prune this, right, technically right now, you've got all of the energy moving through this, and you've got this tip that's accumulating auxin as that hormone. And that auxin is suppressing all of the growth of these buds behind it, okay? So when we come back in and we prune this, however many buds are left on this stem that was growing are going to be stimulated to grow. So if we leave 1, we've got 1 growing stem, we prune back to 1 bud, and 1 bud takes on the energy of that 1 stem. Well, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Why would you prune 1 to get 1? technically, over the course of this tree's life, if we prune 1 to get 2, the strength that was going into 1 goes into 2, that strength decreases, right? And then we prune 1 to get 2 on those 2, and now we get 4, and that strength is now cut into quarters. So if we look at this in terms of the way that we build branching in a tree, and this is almost commonsensical, except for it's not, right? So if we look at this, we have 1, we cut, we get 2, we cut, we get 4, we cut, we get 8, we cut, and we get 16. Now what you would see is you would see the energy that was put into this that gave us that length. As it's distributed, the length of successive growth gets finer and finer, right? Because that energy that was put into 1 goes into 2, 4, 8, and then 16. And this is how we create ramification. Now, what is dictating how much strength goes into each piece of growth? What is dictating how much strength goes into each piece of growth? Someone, anyone? Anybody online? You guys are free to chime in. Okay, foliage mass. Roots. Okay, good. So in bonsai, what is it that makes it a bonsai? The pot. And what about the pot? Just the way that it looks? The glazed color, the size. What about the size? What about the size contributes to this concept of strength? How does it limit it? Yeah, very good. Excellent. Okay? So what I want you guys to start considering now that we're adjusting all of our thought processes, right? We're thinking not when do I do this, but why do I do this and how do I know to do it then? Okay? When we start talking about the strength that goes into this, think about your container as X. Okay? X. X. Smaller the container, the smaller X is. Larger the container, larger X is. The more branches that you distribute X across, the finer those branches become. So if you have a tree in X that looks like that, these branches are naturally going to look like this. They're going to grow like that. And then you're going to cut those, and that's going to go into 2. And those are still, and you're going to cut those, and those are going to go like this. And the more you cut them and the more branches you get, the smaller and smaller they get because you're distributing X. Does that make sense? All right. Kendall, we have any questions from online? We doing okay?
We're just having some internet problems we're trying to solve on the fly. So that's what's happening.
Gotcha. The Milwaukee Center. This happened last time too, huh? Oh, this is the worst? Awesome.
Are we back? We got to restart it.
We're going to restart the stream. Okay, well, we're recording it. It'll be documented, so if they're having a hard time. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm coming back and I'm cutting each one of these back to 2. And this goes for the tiniest branches as well, because if you have tiny, fine ramification and you're allowing that ramification to elongate, you're developing coarser ramification where you had really fine ramification. And this is where an elm really starts to get... Tedious is a bad word in bonsai, right? Because that has negative connotation. I'm going to officially say this is where an elm becomes extremely, extremely tedious, okay? Elms are like the testament to dedication, discipline, and durability as a bonsai practitioner. But you guys know as well as I do that if you put in the time on an elm and you go through this kind of painful task of pruning, and if we think that this is the only time we're going to have to do this year, we are sorely, sorely mistaken, okay? But you know if you put in the time that there is a very few species in the deciduous world that will give you the same thrill and bang for your buck as the ramification of an elm when you get into that winter silhouette when all the leaves are gone. Okay, so this is kind of that thing that you've got to do to have that thing that you aspire to have that you really don't want to do that work to have, and you realize during the growing season you're kind of like, do I really got to do that? It doesn't look that bad. It's probably okay. But if you shine it on and you're able to kind of persevere through this really tedious work, this is what gives you the very best product for that winter silhouette. Okay, so I'm going to finish up this branch, and then I'm going to rotate this so that you guys can take a look at it. And here's the other thing that you guys really should be paying attention to. One of the things that we really aspire to have in a we try to not aspire to have, or one of the things that we try to avoid, is having this super round, evenly created, almost hedge-sheared silhouette, right? And so one of the things that you guys will notice as I rotate this is you'll see that even some of these interior pieces that are growing out to the exterior, I'm even shortening some of these because I want to make sure that I create informality inside of that branch pad as well as in this canopy as a whole, right? So when you think about this, bonsai as a natural reflection, and one of the things that always has struck me, and particularly being back in Japan, is you do see a lot of the trees take on this very globular, and it's amazing. All the branches are out there, and it's like, wow, that took a lot of work because it's not hedge sheared. All of it's very beautifully done, but it's all out at the exterior of the silhouette. But one of the things that strikes me about it too is it doesn't feel or appear very natural, right? And so the way that you avoid that is coming into the interior here and pruning all of these pieces, even the ones that allow us to push that pad in a little bit and create some of those undulations and those informalities inside of each individual pad. Very important part of good deciduous work, okay? So one of the other things about this time of year, we're just passing that point where we could come in here and remove big, gigantic branches and get a really strong push out from the tree, okay? Because this tree is slowing down in its growth. Now, one of the things that people talk about with deciduous trees, when can we do a trunk chop? When can we heavily reduce structure to rebuild? And we're past that point, okay? If you think about this, you've got to be hitting that point, and we talked about this last time, particularly, do you guys remember the Coast Live oak? Where we came in, we pruned it, we halved all the leaves. That oak right now is this ball of super fine, short, tight, ramified shoots as a product of that pruning that we did last month. But right now, if we think about this energy and this ramping up or ramping down of metabolic processes in accordance with the temperature, and we're sitting right here, if we do a big heavy prune right now, we don't have a whole lot of time for foliar growth to occur before the tree shuts down, right? So we want to be holding off. We missed our window for that big prune. We're going to be looking to next spring as the next possible time to do major reduction, trunk chops, or heavy structural reduction on deciduous trees. Okay? Do you guys have any question about how to handle an elm? Any? We feel pretty good? Okay, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because we've got two other trees here that are going to demand a lot more. Elms are okay? Deciduous trees are okay?
Really super quick question.
Yeah. Mike. I'm going to keep pruning if you're going to be talking.
Yeah, real quick question.
We got time.
With respect to propagating elm, I have a catland that I've been trying to propagate. Not a lot of luck for some reason. What's the ideal timing, considering the when it wants to push roots and when it hardens off? And
Right. Yeah. I honestly don't know that for a catland elm. In terms of when would be your best time to take a cutting, how much or whatnot. Because when you start to talk about cuttings on deciduous trees, you talk about softwood, semi-hardwood, or hardwood cuttings, right? Now, naturally, if you're looking at an elm, and this is just from theoretical horticulture, what I would say is right now would be a more effective time on an elm than any other because you're back in an energy positive, right? The reason that you would ever take a semi-hardwood or a softwood cutting on a tree is because you have a really flexible vascular system that would allow rapid transport of resources to create roots from that very soft, fleshy stem. But on an elm, because they spend so much energy pushing out that growth, and if you guys prematurely prune an elm, you'll know, because its second movement or that bud push as a result of that pruning won't give you a very significant flush, right? They need that energy recharge. I would say you're probably going to have more success now than at any other portion of the season, right? But we also know that there's a lot of species that struggle with cuttings and might do better as air layers or might do better as seedlings, and I'm not sure with a catland elm what the best way to propagate is, okay? Yeah?
On cutting things back in the spring, what about the callus development?
In terms of callus development, in terms of when is the best time to get the callus development?
Or it becoming too large.
Or it becoming too large. So obviously, when we start to talk about callus development is a direct result of addition of vascular tissue, right? So when we talk about callus, a lot of people think that callus is independent of the growth of the cambial layer, the xylem, and the phloem. Okay, so say for example, we've got a tree here and we had this branch here, and we cut this branch off like so. Okay, what's creating that callus is actually the addition of tissue throughout the entire vascular system, right? And we've got that cambial layer that's exposed, that's continuing to cellularly divide. So year after year, we get this kind of action and operation. So if we start to talk about callus that's too aggressive, how would you slow down the growth of a tree that has a very aggressive capacity to callus? How would you do that? Think about it now. If callus is just simply the addition of more vascular tissue, how do you slow down the increase of vascular tissue? Okay, less fertilizer, less watering, less foliage. There it is, right? Less foliage. So if you want to slow down the callus of a tree that really aggressively creates vascular tissue, you've got to decrease your solar panels and slow down the supplemental nutrition in terms of additional fertilization, right? And that will significantly decrease the sort of the grotesqueness of an elm's callus. So you may choose to keep this a little bit more pruned back, a little bit sparser in foliage mass for that season or two after you remove big prominent branches or in branches in that immediate vicinity to reduce the callus formation. The other thing you can do is continually shave it back so that you get a big thick callus, you shave that callus back, you repaste it, let it grow again, you shave that callus back and repaste it. Third option is to wrap that callus with like a parafilm or a very thin tape so that the callus can't bulge on its own, and when it's very soft, it conforms to the contour of the tape. Okay, 3 options for you guys. All right, elms, we good? We did it. Okay, off we go. Oosh. How many people have Douglas firs in the room? Yeah? So Scott Elser and I did a progressive demo on Pseudotsuga menziesii. When was that, Scott? Several years ago. Was it already that many years? Yes. Okay. This was not the tree, so I don't want to get your hopes up. And also, I would be disappointed if this was as far along as it had gotten. It's far, far beyond that. Scott's is actually on display at the Pacific Bonsai Museum Natives Exhibition, which is very, very cool to see it. Beautiful display. Okay, Doug fir. Really, really special species. Now, I want to talk about this in terms of elongating species at this time of year, and then I want to funnel down into Douglas fir as a bonsai specimen. And this operation and this approach can also apply to any species that has this kind of fan-shaped foliage, right? Whether this is a redwood or whether this is a taxus, you can apply this same concept to pruning back to buds that are going to become foliar mass. But there is a few nuances of Doug fir. So first, let's start with elongating species. Okay, so over the course of the season with an elongating species, we get this kind of elongating growth. Now, some of our trees we've been pinching. What was our motivation for pinching elongating growth? And you guys saw Todd do that with the Engelmann spruce. Do you guys remember that? And then I came back again, and we'd seen that flush, and it had hardened off, and we'd pruned a little bit as that third pinching. What was the purpose of pinching on the Engelmann spruce? Do you guys remember? Okay, reduce internode length, force buds to grow farther back. So let's just be really clear. When we pinch, we are distributing. That was growth distribution, distributing energy from strong to medium, and then further to weak growth. Okay, we were pushing that energy from strong buds to medium buds to weaker buds. This is how we distribute strength in an elongating species that is in the refinement process. Okay, so we're saying we could do this with larch, we could do this with spruce, we could do this with fir, we could do this with hemlock, we could do this with redwood, right? All of our elongating species, we have the ability strong to medium to weak, okay? Now this tree didn't produce the kind of growth. If you notice, none of these are really super long or growing out of the silhouette in an abundance that I would say I needed to pinch. So we went ahead and we let it grow. But by letting it grow, once it got past the point of pinching, it accumulated enough energy that it started to expand beyond where I wanted it to expand. So now I'm coming back and I'm looking at it and I'm saying, shoot, I didn't pinch it, and then by the time it was long enough that I knew I wanted to shorten it, it was too open to pinch, I would have pulled off the whole stem. Now what do? What did I do? Waited? Waited for what? Okay, Okay, buds to form, waited for back buds. I waited for it to elongate, open, harden, and get back into an energy positive. Okay, and this is where you guys got to go with this. This is in an energy positive state right now. I can come back in, I can reduce this growth, and instead of putting this tree into a position where it doesn't have the energy to respond, we let it open up, harden off, reaccumulate, and now when I prune it, it's got the energy to do something even beyond what I would have hoped for it to do, okay? So that energy positive, important piece of information to keep in mind, all right? Now, Douglas fir as an independent species inside of elongation has a little nuance that you guys ought to know about. If you don't prune at this point in time, prior to the tree moving from foliar growth to vascular growth, and you guys understand that, right? 2 times a year that a tree grows, spring and fall, very good. Now, in the springtime, what is its focus of energy? Foliar, very good. Solar panels. Why is it producing solar panels in the spring? Okay, it's using them. Daylight length is going. Temperature is going. Perfect time to produce solar panels and accumulate energy, right? In the fall, daylight length is going. Temperature is going. Not a good time to produce solar panels and accumulate energy, right? So it says instead of putting my resources into expanding my business when all my customers are going to be moving on to other things until next season, I'm going to save all of that money, build up my internal revenue, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to invest next spring when the daylight length is increasing, the temperature is increasing, okay? So that's that fall to spring growth, or spring to fall, excuse me. So it looks like this. We've got winter, got spring. I had to just erase this because I keep on doing it anyways, huh? Okay, spring, got that summer, got that fall. Okay, so we're saying summer, winter, no growth, or at least very minimal growth. Okay, spring, our focus is foliar. Tree is expanding its solar panels. Fall, vascular. Vascular, okay? If we had one time a year that we would be fertilizing, when would it be? Fall, absolutely fall, right? Because that's when we accumulate the resources, we build the root system, we set up the trunk branching, etc., with all of the highways to transport water and nutrients for the following season's growth. If we don't build that system in the fall, next spring, we won't be able to facilitate the expansion of accumulation and the expansion of the demands of water when we add those highly succulent, water-losing, transpiring pieces. Does that make sense? So we always build first and add foliage second, all right? Now, as a Doug fir, if we don't prune while it's in its foliar phase of growth, any bud that we prune back to will not grow next spring, which is really, really weird, right? Okay? So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to prune off a piece of growth and I'm going to pass it around to you guys. Okay, and I'm going to show this to Ricardo real quick. I'm just going to put the tip of my scissor right at a dormant bud. Can you see that, Ricardo? Okay? So there's dormant buds all over this stem. Now, if I prune back to that right now while it's in a foliar phase of growth, the tree's resources are going to be put into that bud to become a vegetative bud for next spring, all right? If I don't prune it back right now and I wait for it to go into its vascular phase of growth, it will take next spring to turn it into a vegetative piece of growth to grow in 2019. This has taken me a very long time to figure out. Pseudotsuga menziesii is a very complex species with a lot of nuances. This is the big one. Learning to prune right now. I'm going to pass that around. You guys can all see the dormant bud. I've pruned right back to it, okay? And that will turn into a conical terminal bud that will generate vegetation, all right? So in these areas, up in the apex in particular, where I'm accumulating auxin, and we know Doug fir wants to be a very, very big tree, I've got to be shortening this at least to the silhouette for the shape, most importantly, but also to transition energy, because notice down here how these are facing down and they're showing that they're not quite as strong as their apical counterparts in the top of the tree. If I want these to hold strength, and notice too that in any one junction I've got one shoot, whereas up here I've got 3 or 4 shoots in the apical portion of the tree. That too is an indication of strength, all right? So I'm going to go through here and just aesthetically start reducing these so that the tree stops getting as big and so that I start transitioning that energy, and my focus is pruning back to those dormant buds that already exist.
How close to the bud do you prune to?
Gotta get that microphone, Polly.
How close to the bud do you prune back to?
That's a good question. So we're pruning, within a few millimeters, almost like a black pine where you're saving those dormant buds. You don't want to prune right up against them because there is going to be some natural callousing that's happening there, and you don't want the callousing to overtake the adventitious bud. But the cleaner that we prune and the closer we prune, the less that we'll have any kind of swelling around where that new bud originates, and we get a better transition. So we want to be close, but not too close, right? A few millimeters, good enough, okay? Now here's another situation that I want to show you guys in terms of when we have these groups of 3. Now, common bonsai knowledge says in groups of 3, when we come back and prune, we remove that center shoot, correct? Naturally, I mean, that's what you do, right? Okay, but I would ask you guys to reconsider that concept. Okay, because when we start to look at branching and branch formation, if we remove this center shoot, notice the crotch angle that we would have if we leave these two, right? All of a sudden, you start to get a crotch angle that looks like this, very obtuse in terms of its shape. Right, now, when we look at a really good branch formation, typically that crotch has this kind of angle, acute, right? Acute in form. So if we take out that center stem, we're going to have obtuse in form. The best shape we can get is this. But we would ideally like this, right? Now, the one time that we would sacrifice this crotch shape is if that central stem is so thick and strong that it's going to destroy the shape of the tree around it. Now, here when I look at this, I'm saying, boy, this really isn't that overly strong. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to leave this central stem. Now when I come back and I make that decision to prune, I've got to be looking at all the branches around it that are contributing to this same location. And I notice that I have a branch here, but I don't have any branches over here. Do you guys see that? So when I'm looking at that, if I've got a branch here and I'm going to keep 2 of these 3 and I'm going to maintain that central stem, I'm naturally going to drop off the branch that's growing towards that other branch in terms of my shape. Now I've maintained that good spacing between my branches. I can come in here, I can prune this back to interior buds. Prune this one back to interior buds. Stimulate bifurcation, shorten the shape, transition my auxins, set those buds up to become vegetative buds over the course of the fall, and all at once, in terms of a Doug fir, I've just accomplished several very big pieces of work in terms of shape preservation, as well as energy redistribution, as well as bud setup for the following spring, right? And this is the time to be doing it, right now. If you guys have Doug fir, right now is the time.
Could you repeat? We have a question now. It's streamed
Yes.
enough that now there's
Yes.
a question. Could you just repeat your description of how cutting back the Doug fir affects the bud, whether it grows next year or not?
Yeah, sure, I'm happy to do that. So basically what we're saying is, while the Doug fir is still in a foliar phase of growth, which is their spring phase of growth, if we prune back to an interior bud, a juvenile bud, what we get is we get that juvenile bud maturing over the course of the fall into a vegetative bud so that we have the ability for it to grow next spring. But if we wait until the fall to prune, then that juvenile bud will take all of the following spring to mature into a vegetative bud, and it won't grow until 2019. So we have to prune right now if the buds that we're pruning back to are going to grow next year, right? And that is, for Doug fir, one of the most absolutely frustrating things for me has been continuing to try and refine the application of technique to this species, because it has never been used as a bonsai really to date, or very well, right? And in fact, there have been a few times as I was traveling across the country when I was first back from Japan, and these people brought, people that have been doing bonsai for a very long time would bring in Doug fir that they had collected back with Dick Melody and Harold Sasaki. Harold Sasaki is my original teacher from Colorado Bonsai Limited in Denver, right? And Harold was his parents were Japanese immigrants who moved to Hawaii and worked in the coffee fields and the strawberry farms. and Harold came to the mainland to go to school. And he started collecting trees out of the eastern slope of the Rocky Mountains, ponderosa pine, limber pine, Rocky Mountain juniper. He's one of the pioneers, right? Well, him and Dick Melody got the idea that they could start taking people to collect on some of these ranches outside of Estes Park. And as I was traveling across the country, people that had collected some of the original ponderosa pine, Rocky Mountain junipers, limber pine, and Doug firs were bringing these trees in that they've had for literally 30, 40 years as bonsai, which seeing a Doug fir 30 or 40 years later in a bonsai container is a pretty special experience because they form bark so much faster in a bonsai pot than they do in the wild. Did you guys hear that? How is that possible? Why? What? I don't believe you. You're lying. Talk to me about that. Why would that happen? Why would a tree form bark so much faster when it's grown in a bonsai container as opposed to growing in the wild? It's under more stress in a bonsai pot or under more stress in the natural environment? So it's actually getting everything it needs and more in a bonsai pot, right? So when you're growing in a natural environment, the reason that they're so stunted,
just thought you had mentioned at one point that it's not a true fir. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate.
Yeah, nice. I'll come back to that. Thanks, Doug. So when it's in a bonsai container, we're watering it every day. We're fertilizing it. It's too hot. We move it into the shade, right? It's not hot enough. We move it into the sun. This tree is very, very taken care of, right? Well, when it's in the natural environment, it's all about survival. Growing very minimally, and not getting as many resources as it needs. And so the growth rate is extremely slow in the natural environment. Consequently, bark formation is also slow. So coming back to what you said, Doug, this is a pseudotsuga. Pseudo meaning false, right? False fir. So if we talk about what a true fir is, what's the scientific or the Latin name for just the true fir family? Abies. What species of true fir do we know best around here? Subalpine fir. And what is the scientific name for subalpine fir, Greg? Laciocarpa. Nice, Al. Abies laciocarpa, right. So when we start to look at this as a false fir, right, why would they call it a fir in general? False hemlock, pseudotsuga, yeah, right. Nice. Thank you, guys. Keeping me on my toes. False hemlock. Why do they call it a false hemlock? Foliage, maybe? Foliage, yeah, right, exactly. Foliar formation. So they're looking at those similarities. Now, with a hemlock, in terms of the differences of Pacific or Western hemlock versus a mountain hemlock, how can you tell the difference? Needles, what about them?
Western horizontal, mountains all around.
Very good, right? Western lays laterally, and a mountain hemlock is in the full radial formation of the branch, right? Very, very interesting. These are all the pieces that you guys have to know to survive Bonsai Trivia 101 with Mirai Live. Okay, so as I rotate, notice how I'm pulling that shape in. So it was really shaggy, really long, right? We're pulling it all back in, redistributing the strength. Now, down here towards the bottom, I may not necessarily want to be taking as much off if I need strength down in the lower branches. So to allow this to continue to grow, elongate, expand, think about this, okay? This tree has produced a tremendous amount of solar panels with this new growth. I'm cutting all of the pieces back that I'm trying to take the auxin out of, transition growth to those interior buds and give them time to form. But if I actually wanted strength in the tree, the longer that I leave this new foliage mass on, the more it can photosynthesize, the more energy it can accumulate. The more energy it can accumulate and the more it photosynthesizes, the more it transpires. And when we talk about generating backbud or increasing the strength of branching, the more that we move water and resources to the tip of that branch, and the more sugars and starches that it produces. Huh? You hear that? Yeah, you're with it? Sugars and starches? There it is. Okay? The more that happens, that traffic is what generates growth, thickens branches, increases strength. Okay? So these lower pieces that I'm saying, I would like this to be a little stronger, I'd like this to be a little thicker. I would like this to backbud, I would like this to backbud. I'm not going to be pruning those, right? I'm going to allow that foliage to photosynthesize, increase traffic, generate back budding, thicken that branch, and develop, in general, a stronger profile here for me to be able to reduce to. Okay, but in these areas, I do have some of these tips that are extremely long. So I may want to come back into these and be pruning these back as well, taking buds off the bottom, buds off the top, shortening these to the shape of the silhouette, which is still pretty, that's subjective in this tree, right? Because it's not totally wired for this new piece of growth. But taking the strength out of these guys, removing that auxin and pushing some of that energy back into these tips that aren't necessarily as strong as we would like them to be. So the finality of this piece of work would be to take all of these branches that don't have wire, all of these tips that are hanging down, picking all of those up, wire them out, laying them out flat to maximize their photosynthetic capacity, and allow them to accumulate strength over the course of this year. Make sense? Can we get a mic to Paul?
Do you have the same consideration for pruning back as with redwoods? You prune it in the too early a time, it gets pushed back to the trunk?
No, definitely not, right? So this has to be pruned back to a juvenile bud that is set up on that new piece of growth, or say, for example, let me find one here. I had one that I was looking at. No, here, okay? Say, for example, I've got two interior buds here. I've got an elongated piece, and then I've got this tip here. Now, I could prune this all the way back to those, and those would take over, right? Or I could take this elongated piece and prune back to a juvenile bud here. Those are my two options. But if I prune back behind these, right, or I take one of these elongated pieces and I prune it back here, it's a roll of the dice whether or not it's going to push a bud anywhere in this older piece of growth or tissue, right? My better chance of getting a back bud in there is to allow these to elongate, harden, increase traffic, and next year, pinch as it's elongating or allow it to elongate, harden, and prune back like I'm doing this year, okay? So by holding back the apex, by holding back the stronger tips, I'm pushing energy back into these weaker pieces. These will get so much stronger over the course of this year that we'll have a much more viable branch the following season, okay? All right. How are we doing for time?
I think we need to take a break for the auction,
Do we?
right?
You guys ready for a break? All right, let's take a break. When we come back, single flush pine pruning to produce growth, okay? Okay, so I'm just touching up a few pieces of growth here on this so that I can show you guys kind of the final product. And, I don't know if when you guys first saw this and I first started pruning, if you were kind of like, well, that kind of looks kind of crappy, because all the growth was hanging in and kind of floppy and not really looking super sharp. But I've squared up the front, right to the front of this stand here so that you guys can see where I've designed the tree from. And then I hope that you guys can see that just via the pruning of that longer growth and kind of propping up a few of the branches with the wire that already exists, this tree is capable of making a pretty significant transition from something that had an extremely overgrown, unmanicured shape now to starting to take on a pretty defined canopy and shape. That's interesting, isn't it? Yeah. Now, the other thing that you should be noticing is I'm not going in and I'm not cleaning out a bunch of foliage or removing any more than that tip to transition that from that apical bud back to those juvenile buds on the interior. So this is about as far as I'm going to go on a Doug fir right now. But pruning back, I know that those buds are going to develop into mature foliar buds that'll grow next spring. And as far as all of our elongating species are concerned, where we're trying to reduce the growth, or we're trying to clean up that canopy, or we're trying to transition that energy, we have the ability to pull the strength out of the stronger areas and redirect to weaker areas and control and manage that shape right now at this time of year. When that growth is fully hardened, opened up, photosynthesized, energy positive, now we can prune. You got it? We good? Okay, moving on. One thing I wanted to show you guys before we jump into the single flush pine, and I'm going to show the live stream first, okay? So when we talk about pruning an elm is one of the species that's used a lot in pinjing as well as in bonsai. And when they prune elm in pinjing, a lot of times as opposed to pruning very close to the bud, they'll leave a much, much longer stub on the branch itself. Okay, and we're saying, and several of you have come up and they've said, how close to the bud do you prune? And I'm saying I prune within a few millimeters, right? So this would be a bonsai pruning cut within a few millimeters of that bud, okay? But when you're talking about pinjing, or I've also seen this practice with bonsai, if you leave a much longer branch, okay, what ends up happening, so if I leave that big stub right here, and this is the bud that I'm actually transitioning to, what happens is this bud will actually produce a growth that will occur at a relatively long angle to the branch. So as opposed to being very acute, it'll actually be closer to a 90-degree angle. And if you prune like that over the course of time, you get these weird branches that form a much more zigzagged, exaggerated shape and pattern. And over the course of time, this is how you see them training Chinese elms and pinjing to develop some really radical branch shapes that are far more angular and more appropriate for the pinjing model than what we consider for that smoother branching shape of the bonsai model. And if you know that, you can create some very interesting effects on your Chinese elms as you prune over the course of time. Okay? Little tidbit for you guys. All right. Whew. I'm super excited about this tree. I've been letting it grow all spring, no pinching. Let's see if I can. What's the story about this tree? So everybody knows Telperian Farms, right? Chris and Lisa. This is a Telperian Farm Scots pine that has this tremendously powerful trunk. Now the front is actually right off of the corner here. So I'll just set those there and kind of rotate it for you. Now there's a lot of growth in the way, but you guys can see that tremendous base. You can see all of those changes of direction in the trunk. And what I've been doing, this is a Scots pine in development, which means we set the structure, we wired out the structure, and we've been fertilizing this extremely aggressively this spring to try and get as much growth as we possibly can. Okay, now when we're dealing with single flush pines, we've got that concept where we've got to transition from the development to the refinement phase. Okay? Development, we're talking about elongation, thickening, healing, expansion of foliage mass, and generation of backbuds. Those are our reasons for development. Adding foliage mass, increasing traffic, getting those things to happen. Once we get those things to happen, if we get that healing, thickening, elongation, expansion of foliage mass, or generation of backbuds, at that point, when this tree gets back into an energy positive, right at this time of year, we can prune back and transition the energy from the tip back to those interior buds and pieces of foliage mass that we've developed. Okay? So I'm moving from development to refinement. And I love talking about single flush pines because if you guys have cultivated white pine or shore pine or Scots pine to this point, you know that there's not a lot of information out there for you guys about how to handle them. This is like the single, and I told this when I did the pinching of the shore pine in the live stream. If you guys haven't seen it, you should. It's called growth distribution. That singular subject of single flush pines and how you handle their growth was the reason that Bonsai Mirai Live was created, to show that exact technique, because so many students had no idea what to do. Showing that was the major reason that we created Mirai Live. So now to get to show how we transition from development, where we've let this pine grow and we didn't pinch anything, into refinement, another super milestone for Mirai Live. So we're saying development to refinement. Okay, and we're saying we're going to be transitioning, nice, thank you, strength at the tip to interior growth. All right? Awesome. Thanks, Lime. You're welcome. That's beautiful. All right. So what that means is, just because this tree in general has a lot of growth that's generated interior pieces of growth doesn't mean that everything is ready to be pruned. Because there are going to be places on this tree where the branches have not necessarily generated interior buds. And we've got to treat our pines in particular, and this is true for a multi-flush pine like a black pine. We may not decandle every single branch when we start the refinement process because some branches still may need elongation, thickening, etc. With a single flush pine as well, when I look at this branch in particular, I don't really have a whole lot on this branch to be transitioning the energy to. Now I'm going to open this up and there's just a little tiny, Ricardo, can you see that? Just that little tiny green bud right there on my fingertips. There it is. Can you see that? Okay, I need that to have a lot more energy before I start transitioning. Okay, and I'm going to show you guys this. I've got this little tiny bud right here. I need a lot more than that to start pruning this back and transitioning that energy. But when I look at other portions, for example, this branch right here, you see how many interior pieces that are already elongating and have a lot of strength? This is a perfect opportunity to take the strength out of this tip, using the silhouette as my reference, to transition back to those interior pieces and start building that ramification. Now, when I come back in and I prune a single flush pine, number one, I want to take these areas where I've got 3 and 4 shoots, take off either top growing or bottom growing, and leave my 2 laterals. This is fundamental for pines, correct? Okay? So never do I want to leave 2 buds that are like so. I always want to try to leave 2 buds that are laterally oriented. This saves me the hazard or the time of having to wire, okay? Now when I come into this, I've got all of these needles along this, and then I have this inner node here where I don't have any growth. I have to be pruning, leaving at least, let me come back to that, okay? I have to be pruning, leaving at least a few pairs of needles at that base in order to keep viability and life in the tip of that branch, okay? Because when I prune this in the developmental phase, now that I'm back in an energy positive, the new buds that are going to form for next year's growth are going to form right in the axils of these needles that I've left behind, okay? If I take that whole thing off, it's a roll of the dice whether or not I get buds back in this older needle mass behind it, okay? So I've got to leave at least some portion of this new growth, meaning some portion of these new needles, in order to ensure that the tip of that branch stays viable and continues to grow. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay? Now, my decision making in terms of the length of that piece has to do with the shape of the silhouette. So I'm going to start and I'm going to set this branch from the bottom here, and I'm going to work my way up because the bottom branch or the longest branch on the tree generally forms my reference for the rest of the shape of the tree, okay? So for this girth right here, let me just make sure I've got some stuff to transition to. This feels pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to keep this as short as I possibly can right now. Now, why aesthetically would I want to keep this branch as short as I possibly can? Does anybody know? As short, so I'm keeping it as short. So this is an aesthetic decision, right? Because I'm saying I'm pruning back to the shape of the silhouette. Very good, fat trunk. And why would I want short branches on a fat trunk? Accentuates the trunk, right? When we start talking about masculinity and girth, the closer in we bring those branches, the stronger that feels. Now, we can go too far, right? And I don't know if there's any Italian viewers, but Italian bonsai tends to keep branches overly short and the trunk seems excessively large, right? And I don't know if you guys have seen that. Their oaks, some of their pines, some of their junipers, they really decrease that size and that trunk looks gigantic, right? So you can go past that point of diminishing return and achieve an aesthetic that's almost unrealistic naturally, right? Okay, but that feels pretty good proportionally. Now bear in mind, our front is on this front corner. I'm just going to rotate this for you guys. How does that feel? That feel okay? Yeah. Too short? Too long? Still too long?
No, if you said too short, it's too late.
Yeah, well, no, there's no changing that now, right? Yeah. Had to nail it on the first chance, right? The first go-around. Yes, sir?
Are you confident that there will be a bud at the base of each of those branches that you've trimmed?
I'm not confident that there will be a bud at the base of each of these branches, but I'm confident there will be a bud at least one, if not more, of the axils of these needles that I've left. And the reason that I say that is because after this pruning operation, as we describe the fertilization, I'm going to give this another bump of nutrition, knowing I'm tapering off, right? But that supplemental nutrition combined with the reduction of the auxin at the tip, combined with the fact that it's in an energy positive, says that the plant will produce another vegetative mass to stimulate growth next year, right?
So for this plant, if there's a needle, there's a bud.
For this
much.
plant, if there are needles, chances are there will be a bud. Absolutely, right? And this is a big part and a big testament to fertilization, to increase energy, to build up that strength so the tree can respond, right? So if I don't follow through with that process and I don't create that supplemental nutrition and I don't build up this system and the strength and everything that I've been doing, then this operation could fall flat on its face and you prune these tips and that's the end. It just stops right there, right? Experience to date has been, particularly with younger Scots pine, and the Scots pine is in Pinus sylvestris for anybody online that is used to not calling it Scots pine. For young, vigorous, aggressive sylvestris, you can build up the energy and prune these and pretty much plan on growth being in the tip of that branch. Now, a lot of it hinges on timing as well, so that you've got that accumulation and you're back in that energy positive. And I'm going to tell you guys right now, this tree will produce fewer buds than I would like it to by me pruning it this week as opposed to next week or even the following week. Okay, now explain that to me if possible. Why would the tree produce fewer buds this week as opposed to next week or the following week? Less accumulated energy, that's right. The longer that these needles are on here photosynthesizing, the more accumulated energy we have. When we remove that auxin, we push back that tree's necessity to develop more vegetative mass. We're still in the foliar portion of growth for the year, right? That spring foliar season, which is where they add those new adventitious buds for next season. If we waited until the fall and we did this, we would have no buds at that growth site. Absolutely not. Your chances of getting a bud there would be single-digit percentages, okay? Right now, our chances of getting a bud there are 60, 70%, okay? And that all hinges on accumulated stored energy in this tree. So the longer I'm able to wait, the more opportunity I have to generate buds. However, the longer I wait, the more chance I risk of the tree turning from that vegetative to that summer dormancy, and then from summer dormancy to that vascular growth. And if we turn to summer dormancy, we definitely won't get a bud. So there is a push-pull relationship to this operation, right? But I'm telling you right now, with the strength of this tree, I have no doubt that I'm going to get an extremely strong response to this operation. Okay, now let me ask you guys, what would be some indicators that this tree is ready to be pruned or that it has hardened off and is back in an energy positive? Anybody have any idea?
Needles are firm.
Okay, needles are firm. What else? Sharp.
Maybe browning old needles.
Okay, browning old needles, nice, right? And now this is just, the interior needles are just starting to change, right? Very, very beginning of that. We'll probably see that over the next month, right? The color change, not quite complete. Now, if you guys notice at the base of these, you've got a very yellowish tint to the base of these, and you're getting that bluish green tint that we know of as sylvestris color. That yellowish tint or that limey tint at the base says, I'm not totally there, but I'm really, really close. And literally every day, that bluish green color is moving down the needle towards the base of that stem, okay? So ideally, these needles would be fully hardened off to maximize the accumulated energy to push a new bud from the pruning process. I am doing this a little bit early, but in the nature of the BSOP stream where I'm preparing you guys for the work for this upcoming month, you guys are now seeing what you can be doing over the next few weeks to stimulate growth and start to push that energy from the tip to the interior of your single flush short needle pines. Does that make sense? Yay.
Okay, so for a single flush lodgepole, for instance, that has been the outline has expanded beyond where I want it to, but it does have a lot of interior ramification.
Yeah.
Is now a good time just to cut off longer, kind of reduce that whole silhouette to some of those interior branches that can take that level of pruning? So
as that tree hardens off, right, and it gives you those indications, sharpening, darkening, firmly attached, and we start to see some of those older needles take on that color that they're going to start to separate, that is a good indication that it's ready, energy positive, and we can go back in and we can prune, okay? Now, pruning a lodgepole pine like I'm pruning this, I'm not super experienced if a lodgepole pine will give you that, because technically we look at lodgepole as a longer needle pine, until it accumulates a lot of foliage mass, but you very easily could reduce back to interior growth that already has established that terminal bud. Great time to prune a lodgepole. So I'm waiting for my lodgepoles to harden off right now so I can go in, clean bottom needles, prune back overly long, overly strong shoots, and set that tree up to grow through the rest of the season with even distribution of energy. And ultimately, when we start to talk about these operations that we're performing here, at this time of year, you guys have to understand that we're really ideally pruning so that for the rest of the season, we've got an even distribution of energy across the tree. Because for our single flush pines, like our ponderosas, our lodgepoles, our limbers that are long needle, or our single flush shorts like our sylvestris or our zoetios or our shore pines, right? We don't balance energy by needle plucking. That's not the methodology that we use. We balance energy by pruning back stronger pieces and allowing weaker pieces to continue to grow, okay? And so understanding that transition of the technique is what allows you guys to make the kind of decisions in terms of when, why, and how you're going to handle that growth to get the kind of response that the tree has the capacity to give you when you do the things you should be doing. So even in these areas where I've got excessively strong growth and I'm getting these 3, now we talked about the fact that we want that acute angle. I'm going to save this central strong shoot. I'm going to take out that weaker one, and I'm going to prune this back to a few pairs of needles as it fits into the shape. So this is an interior branch. I'm going to prune that back and give priority to my exterior branches. I've got interior buds on this branch, so I can take these tips, I can prune these back. I don't want these to get any longer. And that'll reallocate energy to these interior finer pieces. Okay, I've got some pieces on the interior here. I'm going to elongate these. Now notice, this is out just slightly past it. Instead of pruning it back so short, I'm just going to prune back that tip a little bit so that this gets all the way out to my silhouette. Did you see that? So just a little bit of growth. And I'm allowing that to elongate all the way to the exterior portion of my silhouette. And ultimately, when we're looking at this branch, right, from a bird's eye view, and you've got your branch here, and you've got these pieces, if you have a short branch on the interior that has this elongating candle, and it starts to open up and harden off, we can prune here, and this is what gives us a wider expanse of a branch. Now, what would encourage you to have a wider branch versus a more narrow branch? Aesthetically, what would impact that design choice? Okay, very good. A masculine versus feminine tree. So what do we have here? Is this tree masculine or is this tree feminine? Why do you say masculine? Thick trunk. And bark. Okay, thick trunk in proportion to height, right? So this is very important. Proportionally, the trunk is very girthy. Movement is smooth or angular? Angular, very good, right? Thick and angular, masculine features. Thin and fluid, feminine features. Masculine features, wider branch. Feminine features, narrow branch. And all of a sudden, you guys already have some guidelines as to how you're going to be treating these branches to achieve an aesthetic inside your branching that complements the characteristics of the tree. Whew. Whoa. Love it. Love it. Okay. So right in this area here, Ricardo, be sure that everybody can see this area here. Okay, and I'm going to rotate this for you guys. Notice how sparse this area is here, right? There's not really any branching. We've got this big, thick piece that we'll probably try to graft a branch onto since we've got this really compact. But notice that there's no back budding, there's no interior finer pieces of growth, etc. This is an area where I can't come back in here and prune, okay? Because if I prune, I may be able to shorten this, but there's nothing that I'm transitioning the energy on the interior to. So I would be far better off to allow this to elongate, open, harden, accumulate resources over the course of the year, transpire, photosynthesize, increase traffic, and get buds back in along here before I ever go back in and prune. Because bear in mind, if I come in here and I cut this, I'm decreasing the amount of transpiration, I'm decreasing the photosynthesis, I'm decreasing the traffic, I'm decreasing my ability to get back buds. Okay? Because a lot of times we've been taught over the course of our bonsai practice, if you prune, it back buds. Well, maybe if it's a trident maple, but not if it's a pine. Okay? So we're adjusting now in our practice of bonsai in the Western world to understand, Growth is what stimulates back budding, not the pruning process, right? And I'm sure all of us have pruned a tree that wasn't all that healthy because we wanted interior budding and we pruned it and nothing happened, and then the tree got a little weaker and a little weaker and a little weaker, and we thought, I thought I should prune it. They told me to prune it. They said pruning is how you get back budding, and I pruned it and it died, or it got weak, or it ruined the tree. Have we all? Cool. I'm glad that we're all honest about it, right? Okay. So anywhere where I've got interior pieces, I'm taking into account interior branches. This is an interior branch right here, right? It exists on the inside, not on the exterior silhouette. I've got smaller buds back in here I'm transitioning energy to. Interior branches, we keep those tight. We keep those in because we've got this is our silhouette. We've got this is our interior. If these grow as long as our silhouette, now we've got two silhouettes and no interior. So we keep these nice and short to develop this. Just the same, when you guys watched me prune this, these interior pieces right here are as important as these exterior pieces, okay? Now, when I'm looking at this, one of the ways that we create interest in the silhouette, if this is our front, notice how if I allow these to elongate right here, okay, and I'm going to rotate, I'm talking about this branch that I'm holding. If I allow these to elongate, notice how the silhouette goes out, in, and out again. You guys see that? This is how we generate interest in the silhouette. So if this silhouette just goes, whoop, that's the most boring silhouette on a tree that we can create, okay? So if I have the opportunity in upper portions of the tree to just pick up a little bit of length, then I've got something here giving me a little bit of shortness, right? And then I got more length. My silhouette forces your eye to move, okay? So as I'm pruning, I've got to be thinking about that. I'm seeing, ooh, I've got the opportunity to get a little bit of movement, force the viewer to work a little bit. So I'm going to take these strong guys off. I'm going to shorten this. I don't want this growing over this branch, okay? I don't want this piece growing over this piece. So I'm going to shorten that. I've got interiors in here. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to shorten this. And then right here, I'm going to keep some length. So I'm going to take off the tops, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to let these elongate right here so that I get that length right there. You see that? Boom, boom, boom. Okay? Always interesting decisions to be made. And now I want to keep the rest of this fairly short. Notice how this is growing over this bottom branch right here. Do you guys see that? I got to push that in, and I've got these interior branches that are super fine. Eventually, I'm assuming I'll take this off. Eventually, I'm assuming that I'll cut this back to interior pieces. I'm going to keep this as short as I possibly can. I've already got nice small buds in here. I've already got a nice small bud right there, so I'm going to take this back. I want that short. I got a little length here. I want this short.
Ryan?
Yeah?
On those interior branches that are going nowhere, and they have upset...
What do you mean going nowhere?
Well, they don't have any buds in the back. And they have an up and a down kind of extension.
Okay.
Normally, we take those off. But in that case, would you leave them on to increase foliage?
So yeah, we're going to leave. Anytime we get interior budding, this is an interesting thing. We always say we want budding, we want budding, we want budding. And then we get a bud and we say, well, it's not in the right place, so I'm going to cut that off. Now I need more budding, right? When you get that bud on the interior, you grab onto that, you hold onto it like a pit bull with lockjaw, right? That is your bud. That is what you worked for. That is what you were striving for. When that bud grows long enough, you're going to lay that down and you're going to fix that structure while it's still young so that it forms, as it thickens, the angle that you actually want. And if you do it while it's young, it elongates, it's strong enough to be wired, you lay that down. As it thickens, you'll never know that it grew off the top or the bottom, right? Because that shoulder will thicken in the position that you form it. So we're going to keep everything that we get on the interior. That is absolutely a priority. You guys learning a lot tonight? Tight. Gotta keep me home. Yeah. Got that. Everybody's like, we saw the heat. We survived. Now we're learning about pines. Sounds cool. Oh, I'm very excited about getting to do this. In fact, this tree, was a challenging tree. This is actually one of my students' trees, and he said, I'm not, I don't really, it's cool, but there are other trees that are cooler, and I was like, I'll take it. You don't want it, I'll take it. So we worked out a trade. This was a tree that I received in trade, and I am very satisfied with its growth and progression.
How long have you been working on it?
I've been working on it for, let's see, this will be the second year that I've had it. Second year that I've had it, it had never been wired. It had just been pruned, and some of the structural flaws had been removed. So this is definitely just the beginning of where it's actually going to go. But you can already start to see. And anybody go to the Pacific or the Seattle auction this year? Yeah, you went to the auction. There was a Scots pine that I put in the auction that didn't sell. Yeah, that was 3 years from stump. So this is, in its second year from basically starting its progression as a bonsai. In 3 years, this will be very close to a showable tree. But, the interesting thing is we say 3 years and it'll be close to a showable tree. And I would say moving from the development to the refinement for a single flush short needle pine is roughly a 3-year transition. So you just start to see the fruits of your effort after 3 years, and then you start to get this exponential increase in quality once you make that transition definitively. And that's really where we're trying to head with this. You guys have any other questions? How are we doing for time?
I have yet another question.
Okay, how are we doing for time before you get there?
It's 8:30.
8:30? Okay, cool. What do you got, Al?
White pine, western white pine, repotted in the spring.
Okay.
It's healthy.
Okay.
Can I practice the same technique on it?
Is it brimming with health? Is it exploding?
Well, the flush was good. It wasn't like gangbusters.
You gotta have gangbusters. The fact that a sylvestris is giving us this kind of elongation is what's allowing me to do this, and this is really the key for you guys, right? Health versus super duper healthy versus that's obnoxiously healthy, right? And when you get that obnoxiously healthy, which typically does not happen the same year that you repot, is when you're looking at it. So you're probably looking to next season's growth for this kind of accumulation, right? Your job now to get that tree from where it is to where it needs to be is aggressive fertilization, back it off over the summer, pick it back up in the fall. Because if you guys want good growth next year, your fall season fertilization is how you accumulate that resource, build that vascular system. The tree's going to build that first and produce the growth because of that vascular system. Your fall growth is what will dictate next year's spring response.
Ryan,
yes, sir.
Regarding fall growth or fall fertilization.
Yeah.
Typically, we've been told to use 0-10-10. Do you use a nitrogen-based fertilization?
Yeah. So let's. So just to clarify, so that I don't totally slaughter myself. If we're talking about conifers, right? If we're talking about conifers, then I'm going to use a nitrogen balanced feed even in the fall, because conifers aren't typically stimulated to grow simply by the application of supplemental nutrition, right? Now, if we're talking about a maple, Japanese maple in particular is notorious for this. You give them nitrogen in the mid to late fall and we get a warm spell, all of the water returns to the tips of the branches that was receding, right? Returns to the tip, you get another push, we get that cold spell, and all that water's in the tips, and you get the loss of the tips, or you get significant dieback. That would be where a 0-10-10 would be appropriate, right? So as far as our pines, our junipers, our spruce, our hemlock, our firs, our larches, etc., I am very, very adamant about nitrogen-based fertilizer even in the fall to be able to build up and give the tree what it needs for the setup of its foliar growth the following season. And that nitrogen contributes to that bud growth as well as the green growth that results from that bud setup, and it's important, yeah.
Ryan?
Yes?
The new shoots that you're allowing to elongate, would now be a good time to also wire those, or do you need to let them harden off a bit more?
I would probably let them harden off a bit more. So if I'm going to do this kind of work, I'm probably looking at coming back to this tree next year, right? So even if these are all laid out, this shape is never going to be really beautiful with this kind of growth on it, but I'm making that transition to be pushing into the interior and getting a finer and finer growth. My quality growth will actually be next year, and I'll come back and wire it next year. right? So this is still very much that developmental stage of the tree's sort of, evolution as a bonsai. I don't want to get too hung up on the final product of the work. Now, having said that, I do want to make sure that these branches are wired and that everything is laid out to maximize its photosynthetic efficiency. And a lot of times what we get the misconception of practicing bonsai is we have to get the back budding first before we wire. But ultimately, if you don't set the structure of this tree and lay this out to be photosynthetically efficient, your ability to encourage back bud is significantly impaired, right? So we say we set the structure, and then we develop, and then we transition once we get what we wanted from development to refinement via this methodology, right? So you set the structure. This tree was wired before I came. Because it was wired, we got interior buds based on that growth. Now we're taking that growth, and where it's appropriate, we're transitioning that growth. And now in the areas that we transition, next year we will be pinching and starting the refinement process. Okay, and this is that transition. Now notice there's a lot of pieces here where I don't have anything on the interior that I'm not decreasing these because I want to draw that movement of energy, that traffic, water and resources, sugars and starches, and I get that back budding. I'll be able to prune next season. And I'll have to transition anything that's in development right now next season via the pruning process. Anything that I've pruned, I can be transitioning via pinching, or maybe I need to let it grow and prune again. Does that make sense? Every single branch, every time we look at this tree in the springtime, we're going to be like, boy, that budded so much better than I thought. I can actually start to transition from strong to medium to weak. I'll pinch. And then there's going to be some places where we're going to say, Ryan, that guy didn't know anything about what he was talking about. I pruned it and I don't have a single back bud, or I don't have a single bud growing. What a joke, right? And you're saying, now I got to let it grow again. So goes bonsai, right? Like, it's like, I don't know what to tell you, Okay, we're getting there. At least it's still growing. That's right. That's the hope. Okay, so the other last piece that I'm going to leave you guys with before we wrap up tonight, any of these groups of 3, even in areas that I'm developing, I'm taking them down to 2 so that I don't get those excessive swellings at those junctions, okay? So I want to be sure to be fixing structural flaws as I'm transitioning strength, as I'm managing strength, as I'm encouraging movement from the tip to the interior. This is the final product, okay? So again, I'm going to show you guys the front. Let me pull some of these pieces out here. And it's kind of taken on a shape that's reminiscent of a bonsai, sort of, kind of, right? Like you can see it and you're like, oh, I see it. Yeah, that looks good. I thought Ryan Neal was better than this. But when you guys build a tree, right? There's a big difference between when you build versus when you have a tree. Like you could take a collected piece of material and it's got all the branches already and you lay them down and you fan them out and you style it and you say, that's bonsai, right? But there's different approaches to bonsai. When you get a field-grown tree like this thing had, there's a gigantic scar here. This thing had a trunk or a stump that big sticking out of here, and it had another one here that was kind of healing. And this branch here was sticking straight up, and this, apex, we cut off the whole front side here, and this was pointing back here. When you guys take on field stock, you've got to build, and you've got to understand how to build, right? Because taking a piece of Yamadori that has all the branches and laying it out and saying, I know how to do bonsai, that's one aspect of several different genres of how you make a bonsai, right? So this is a tree from a field-grown piece of stock that we are literally creating. And this is how the creation process takes place. Okay, yeah.
Hey, I just want to give a little pump for the Q&A that you have every Thursday. Folks may not realize this, but he gets questions from all over the place. They want to know about olives. They want to know about maples. They want to know about all kinds of different species. They want to know different times of year. The questions are very wild and varied. They're not topic specific, so you're missing a lot if you're not watching that.
The impromptu Q&A, it's available for Tier 3 for all innovators. The impromptu
pretty serious.
What's that?
They're pretty serious sessions.
It's gotten very legit. It is forcing me to raise my bonsai game to keep up. But yeah, I appreciate that, Scott. If you guys are interested in all things bonsai or just simply coming out of left field with your questions, I'll tell you if I don't know. I'm not embarrassed to say I don't know. But a lot of the time, I do have something to add to the question to help move in the right direction or satisfy it. And It's become, for me, one of the highlights of Mirai Live. Doing this on Tuesdays is great. Doing that on Thursdays is like, it's like the Jeopardy of bonsai. Yeah.
Are those Q&As archived so you can come back?
They are
and watch
archived.
them?
So all of the Q&As are archived under that week's stream. So this will be this week's stream, the BSOP. The Q&A will be archived under this stream. And if you go back through all of the streams, all of the Q&As to date have been archived. So you can watch all of them, right?
So they're in the extended cut video tab underneath the main video.
Yeah, yeah, you'll see it in there, right? Yeah. We okay? Yeah, Ricardo, we got hand signals. Junior, you all right? Yeah. Got it, okay. Any more questions from you guys? Yeah.
When you mentioned that coming out and going in and coming back out, is that exclusive to a masculine tree, or do you also practice that with a feminine, taller length?
Good question, good question. I think this is how you create an interesting silhouette on any bonsai, right? Because when we talk about the worst silhouette is the dome, right? And if you walk in and you're creating a tree and you're presenting it and you're like, I hope everybody that enters this room loves this tree, right? The first opportunity you have to capture somebody is when they look at that tree and see that silhouette. And if you got the dome, they're going to say, got it. But then there's another tree here that's got this asymmetry, and your eye moves in and out, and you're saying, you see that? I need to go check that out, right? That's your first opportunity to grab somebody. So any tree where you can create movement in the silhouette, you immediately create visual interest. You immediately grab the viewer, and that is one of the things that you can use as a tool. Again, and I say this to you guys every time, I'm going to say it again. Mr. Kimura's most redeeming genius, brilliance as a bonsai creator was not bending branches. It was pruning to create movement, right? And that was his fundamental backbone pillar of creation, was pruning to create movement. If you guys can maximize movement in the canopy of the tree and force people's eyes to work, you will have far more engaging and exciting bonsai. Okay? Just to recap, right? Now we had the elm where we're pruning back to 2, taking what was put into 1 into 2, right? We're going to be doing this tirelessly over the course of the year. As they elongate, that growth hardens, accumulates energy, energy positive, pruning back to 2, getting that increase in ramification, 1 to 2 to 4 to 8 to 16. Now we got a finished tree, kind of, right? For the temporary time being, until it grows again. Okay, for our elongating species. Now that the growth has elongated, hardened, reaccumulated, energy positive, we can go back and adjust that shape, and we won't need to touch that tree for the rest of the year. In particular, on a Doug fir, when we prune back to those juvenile buds, we must do so in this spring foliar phase of growth, or those juvenile buds will not become foliar buds that can grow next season. Okay? For our single flush short needle pines, right now, when that new growth has hardened, we can go back in. If we need to transition from the tip to interior buds or growth that exists, we can prune back, leaving some portion of new growth, expect a bud on that portion of new growth, and see that energy pushed into the interior. For pieces that we still want to elongate and continue to develop, we're going to stay hands-off. And as we move into the summer season, we're going to be tapering down on our fertilization, knowing lower quantity, lower amounts, or longer amounts of timing between those applications. And when we hit the peak heat, we're going to back off entirely so we don't contribute to water uptake or compete with water uptake. Whew. Did we do it? Thank you guys very much. Thank you guys for joining us online. BSOP, we love you. Super rad, guys. Thank you. All right.